Good morning, Dr. White here with your Module 3 feedback video. This will be the first of two videos that you get from me today. The second will be a Module 4 brief introduction. So with the Module 3 project, what I'm going to do is provide feedback the same way that I did for Module 2. That is, I'll ask you to go to the discussions page right now and have it open so that you can close read a couple of representative examples with me. I am going to use two new students' work, and the goal here is to look at some representative issues that we might be able to improve on in other papers, and also to point out a lot of the good stuff that you're doing, because from what I've seen of these abstracts, they're looking good again. You guys are on top of it, so well done. So take a second, open up the page in the discussion board thread, and we're going to start at the top with Zoe's paper. Zoe has been actively engaged with me via email on some points that she wanted to just clarify, so I have a feeling that her abstract is going to be pretty on target to start. So, Zoe chose to go ahead with one of the themes from the 8th International Conference on Health, Wellness, and Society. I believe specifically she was doing theme 2, Interdisciplinary Health Sciences, although maybe she's doing theme 4. Actually, Zoe, you should probably just let us know where that is in your abstract. Like, just indicate up top. As an abstract reader would want to know which of those you're responding to. All right. So Zoe's working on an approach to reducing vaccine exemptions. This paper explores the complex issues surrounding state-based immunization laws and their simultaneous exemption policies, while describing practical approaches to abbreviating the exemption outbreak. With the recent expansion of non-medical exemptions touching 18 different states, the U.S. has experienced bursts of diseases citizens never thought they would encounter, including measles and meningitis. This paper reconsiders the convoluted social, legal, and moral issues surrounding vaccine exemptions. Okay, we now know that Zoe is looking, I believe, at theme 2, interdisciplinary there. So let's take a look at those first three sentences, because each of those has a distinct function and it does it very, very, very well. So sentence 1, this paper explores. We want to know exactly what the paper does. We just need to know that before we get into the specifics or nuances of it. And Zoe does a great job of telling us what this paper is interested in. And she also gives us a little bit of a sneak preview of what we're going to get into later on when she says describing practical approaches. So that's a little clue, readers, that we're going to be looking primarily here at a community of practice audience. Anytime we're looking at practical approaches to solving a problem, right, that involves practicing usually. So just a heads up there, that's a good thing to include a little key signal phrase like that, because again, it's a signal that to the reader of the abstract, it's a signal that the writer of the abstract, in this case Zoe, has a particular audience in mind, a purpose for writing, and likely from there, ways to get it done. Second sentence, with the recent expansion, where she's telling us what concern she's responding to and demonstrating expertise with specific, precise information such as 18 different states, and naming 2 examples of diseases that we're encountering because of vaccination exemption policies. And then third sentence, this paper reconsiders, and then she tells us what exactly it does. So that really short, brief, what this paper does sentence there, you could almost think of that as a thesis statement for this thing. And again, that's like really important to include, because it tells us how we're going to address the topic that was mentioned in sentence 1 and how we're going to relate to the trend in sentence 2. So, sentence 4, vaccine hesitancy among Americans is the highest it has ever been, and there's an urgent need to address dropping immunization rates. The question of whether or not to allow non-medical exemptions from vaccinations has been largely reduced to a moral debate explored in Emhoff et al. Paper. Is there a moral right to non-medical exemption? This paper argues that conscientious or philosophical grounds become invalid when such actions put public health in grave jeopardy. So I want to pause here and look at this kind of cluster of sentences here. Sentence 4, vaccine hesitancy among Americans is the highest it's ever been, and there's an urgent need to address dropping rates. Um, and then the question of whether or not to allow non-medical exemptions from vaccinations has been largely reduced to a moral debate. Um, One suggestion I would make here, Zoe, you kind of take a little bit of a step. Sorry, my nose is really itchy today. You kind of take a little bit of a step back from the specificity when you go from what this paper does to vaccine hesitancy. So you may want to actually chop the vaccine hesitancy sentence because, frankly, that's a kind of a higher level thing than what you're doing earlier. Like, if vaccine hesitancy conceptually is up here, recent expansion is more specific. Like, it comes from vaccine hesitancy. So I would move that sentence. I do think that the question of whether or not to allow non-medical exemptions is appropriate there because that's a precise question that you're addressing, and it would make sense to me to bring that in there, particularly because you relate it to a source, which works well, and then your flow into the Billington and Omer sources works well too, I think. So you really want to connect to those sources pretty quickly after you say what your paper is going to do. I do have a couple of writing suggestions here. After you introduce the titles of those two papers, Is There a Moral Right and Use of Fees, you then say this paper. This paper is really ambiguous there because we don't know what this refers to. It could be the source you just introduced. I mean, I'm sure it is, but it could also mean your paper. So you want to change that this to a possessive. Or just, yeah, so just like Emhoff et al. Argue that conscientious or philosophical grounds. And the next one, Ellington and Omer find a significant evidence. And that's just a matter of clarity. But that's a point that I think would apply to other abstracts as well. So if you're listening to this and you're not Zoe, which will be most of you, take note. Let's take a look at the last sentence. The use of administrative fees to deter the growing number of non-medical exemptions could tackle the issue with little resistance and offer a reproducible approach for reducing exemptions across the country. That's a solution. That's awesome. I'm really glad that that's there. It needs to be there. But you really want to follow through with that a little bit more. Like, how might that be implemented? How will you explore this solution? What sources might connect to it? Has it been done anywhere? You don't need to answer all of those questions, but you do need to tell us a little bit more about it. So, for instance, if we go back to the sentence about vaccine hesitancy, the use of administrative fees to deter the growing number of non-medical exemptions, little resistance, reproducible approach. In doing so, we might work around vaccine hesitancy, which study blank shows is the highest it has ever been. Has there ever been a case study where... Oh, there is, actually. That's the Omer source. This paper finds significant evidence the addition of processing fees will avoid the use of taxpayer funding for exemption processing. So let's connect that a little more directly to vaccine hesitancy and how it could be combated. And then I think you do also want to offer a slightly clearer distinction between your project and the two sources you list. You don't really carve out your own opinion yet. Like, you're definitely doing a great job of applying their sources, those two sources. You're definitely doing that really well, but we need to see how you're putting them together and how your particular use of them might allow you to do something a little bit different. And I think that moving the vaccine hesitancy sentence down and then focusing on addressing dropping immunization rates, that's how you want to do it, I think. You might connect that to the issue of conscientious or philosophical grounds becoming invalid. Maybe look at some of the justifications for policies that have been made in certain states, like what's the rationale behind the exemptions, and you might combat that. I just want to see, as a reader of this abstract, as an expert reader of this abstract, I just want to see a little more specificity in how you're going to do this, Zoe. So let's skip down to the next example from Brittany. So Brittany is looking here at the Diabetes Congress Graduate Conference in Berlin, Germany. Probably a nice spot to visit as well. In responding to the CFP, Brittany's paper is going to be titled "The Role and Responsibility of the Community in Diabetes Management and Prevention." This paper explores the important role, and then she lists the people involved. Great job. You're appealing to a community of practice there and discourse communities as well. Diabetes is an epidemic affecting the U.S. at a rapid rate. Okay, so now we can see the background of it. This study is designed to measure reduction in hemoglobin A. So this is a study proposal here. Many community policymakers are hesitant to invest in educational programs. Okay, that's a good move. However, in the 2017 study, good job, Brittany. Cash et al. Concluded. Good. The program implemented cost good. Further more participation in program social workers rather than low. Good. The 2015 study concluded. Okay. All right, Brittany, you're doing a great job here of calling our attention to two specific sources and how they're addressing this topic. Really good job here. It's clear that your annotated bibliography exercise was very helpful. I can see you drawing on that. Let's take a look at your payoff. Rather than explore the care patients receive from a community program for education and management of diabetes, this paper seeks to explore a state in which policymakers invest in a free community program provided to all patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus to analyze the healthcare savings for patient and overall patient disease management in terms of hemoglobin A1C levels, fasting and postprandial glucose levels, overall education about disease. So, Brittany, great job using your sources and directly speaking to the conference concerns. You've identified a particular audience, community of practice, and discourse community-wise, and you're naming sources that you're using, that you're drawing on. Great work. Two suggestions. One, it's a little bit difficult to see what your sentence 3 does. This study is designed to measure the reduction in hemoglobin A1C in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus, as well as patient satisfaction with educational information received in individualized tailored plans set for each patient. I think what's throwing me off is the use of the word study there, because as a reader of an abstract for a conference, it's not really that you're presenting a study, you're presenting a paper on a study, if that makes sense. The study itself would be written and published in a journal, whereas a paper that's given, study results would be included, but you're actually presenting a paper that comes from the study. So I think you just want to switch your approach a little bit there in how you're thinking about it and say something like the result, like reading two studies that measure reduction in hemoglobin A1C patients with type 2 diabetes, as well as this paper suggests how policymakers might better meet the needs of type 2 diabetes patients. Specifically, this paper cites scientific studies in order to offer policy-oriented approaches to improving community health via free community programs implemented at cost-effective levels. So we just need a little more, not really translation of the scientific discourse community jargon. It's not a translation issue at all. It's much more about connecting the scientific part of it to the policy part of it. There needs to be a slightly clearer connection between the scientific jargon and the policy part is what we need to see a little bit. And you do begin to do that in your final sentence when you mention that you're going to analyze healthcare savings per patient in terms of hemoglobin levels, fasting and postprandial glucose levels, and overall education. You do mention that. You do begin to build that connection. We just need to see it a little more precisely, I think. So what I would really recommend doing there is, again, is even just adding, I think, like one sentence to the end of this to connect to specific community roles, because we don't really have community roles outlined here. This is really focused on the scientific side of it. So just show how these policymakers might be reached a little bit more. Your science is clearly sound, but like, what's the appeal going to be to them? How are we going to reach out to them? And are there any case studies where this has, there is a case study where this has happened. So show how we're going to make this get implemented a little bit. We just want to see a little more clear connection there. One more tip also, and this applies both to Brittany's abstract and Zoe's. When you're mentioning an article title, you want to use quotation marks. A journal title would be italicized, but an article title or a paper title is quotation marks. And that rule holds across citation and formatting types. So there's a couple of representative examples. What I hope your main takeaways are here is that there needs to be a really clear connection between scientific jargon, discourse, community knowledge, and payoff. And that's because, again, you are going to have a large audience of experts from across different kind of specialties who are brought together by community of practice concerns. So that discourse community specific knowledge might need a little bit of translating or connection to other discourse communities that are, again, brought together by the shared concerns of the community of practice. So that applies to both your papers a little bit. Brittany's a little bit more so. In terms of the takeaways from Zoe's paper, I would just say make sure that, again, you're really working towards specific argument in the middle of this abstract, and if you want to kind of show the payoff at the end a little bit, that would be where you could connect to a higher level concern. Again, in her case, it would be taking the administrative fees and connecting it back to maybe moral or ethical issues around vaccine hesitancy. So in terms of structure, I could clearly see that they're both following the example, which is really helpful, and they're both speaking to discourse community and community of practice concerns using expert jargon and clearly connecting to it. We just want to see a little more fusion, I think, between discourse community and community of practice, and that is something that I've seen in a few of these other of these abstracts, so I hope you can take away from that and apply it to your own. What I will add in closing, though, is that the actual writing, the sentence level writing, the clarity, the coherence, the cohesion in these abstracts is quite strong. Both Brittany and Zoe do a great job of that. So if you might be struggling with that, if you got some critique in your forms of writing assignment on that point, take a look at their abstracts because they're both doing really good jobs with it. I'll be back in touch momentarily with a Module 4 update, and have a good weekend.